For the lesson, if you'd like to follow along with me, I'll be reading from John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17. I'll be reading from the New International Version. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No," Peter said, "you will never wash my feet." Jesus answers, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "A person who's had a bath need only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that is why he said, "Not everyone was clean." When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightfully so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them."
Thank you, brother, for that scripture reading this morning. Definitely a very strange story if we're unfamiliar with it, but certainly one that is full of humility and showing how Jesus would become the greatest servant, and a role reversal there. You know, in churches all over the world, we enjoy familiarity and comfort, don't we? We like our routines. We like things to be exactly the way they've always been. And sometimes this can show up in ways that are familiar to us, right? We like a certain number of songs before the lesson. We like our prayer for the offering to come after communion, not before. Sometimes our prayers look and sound the same. We use the same words, the same phrases. And these are fighting words, but if you sit in this section of the pew, we're going to fight to the death over it, because this is my section, nobody else's. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with any of these things, that's the way that we like it. That's the way that it is familiar to us. And once we've been set in our ways, it's really hard for us to change. It's really hard for us to even think about doing it differently. And this is how it was for the religious leaders in Jesus' day too, but taken to an unhealthy level. They had grown to their customs, right? The way that they had their assumptions about God, what it means to be blessed by him, what true righteousness looks like. And so that's what they were familiar with. And we're going to be beginning a new study in the book of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 5, looking at the Sermon on the Mount. And in this sermon, Jesus is going to be flipping people's worldviews upside down. He's going to be calling them to step outside of their comfort zone and to challenge their own assumptions, their own definitions of blessing, and really what real righteousness looks like. And so this morning, I want for us to start in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 3, and answering the question, what does it mean to be poor in spirit, and how does that tie to being a citizen of God's kingdom? Now, in this sermon, Jesus begins with a controversial statement. Matthew chapter 5, verse 3 says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And again, as I said before, Jesus is flipping societal and cultural norms on their head this entire sermon. We're going to see things later like what we do with retaliation, or loving your enemies, or giving. How do we handle those things? And in this particular verse, the Jewish thought on being poor would not have been conjoined to entering God's kingdom. They would have seen the poor as the outcasts, the disgusting, the ones that you don't want to associate with. They're no better than the tax collectors and the prostitutes and the paralyzed and the deaf and the mute. They all lump them together in the same category. But Jesus wasn't talking about being physically poor. He was talking about being spiritually poor. But what is important for us to catch here is that being physically poor has a lot of things that overlap with being spiritually poor. And if we think about it, right, rich people in this world, even in our day and age as it was back then, have no dependency on anybody. They can buy whatever they need, buy whatever they want. They do whatever they want, when they want it, and how they want it. And if they have any troubles in life, they just throw enough money at it until it fixes the issue. Now you contrast that with poor people, those who are truly in poverty, and they have a dependence on everyone and anyone to get anything they can. They're at the mercy of those who supply their food, their housing, and even their transportation. And if they have troubles in life, they have to grin and bear it because they can't throw enough money at it to fix it until it's gone. And so if we compare this to the spiritual reality, much of these same truths are overlapping. Because the prideful who think that they're spiritually rich and independent from God will not stand justified before him. Take, for example, with me, turn over to Luke chapter 18. There's a parable Jesus told about a tax collector and a Pharisee in their heart postures towards God. Luke chapter 18 in verse 9. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves and that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed like this: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector right here. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all I have. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus says in verse 14, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. And so the question I have for us then is what the Pharisee was doing physically, giving tithes and fasting, was that wrong for him to do? I don't think so. The Bible even calls us to give of our possessions to those who are in need, give it to God, and even calls us to fast. So maybe in some ways the Pharisee actually looks like he's doing a better job than us. But the issue was not what the Pharisee was doing physically. The issue is the attitude or the thoughts that the Pharisee had towards others. Because really, at the end of the day, what he was doing was good, but his heart was in the wrong. And we know that if we read the rest of Scripture to see what God has to say about the heart, that God will judge the heart at the end of time. It's the person that you are on the inside when nobody is watching, when nobody is around, when nobody can hear your thoughts. That is the part of you that is known by God. And that is what the Scripture refers to as the heart. Jeremiah 17 verse 10 says, I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind, to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruits of his deeds. God is the one that tests the heart. And so the Pharisee that we talked about in Luke 18 has a heart that is dependent upon his own works, and upon his own pride, rather than a dependency upon God. And what we need to understand about being spiritually poor is that it's communicating an idea of having humility and childlike dependence upon God. And none of us really are ever going to experience the blessing of heaven unless we are poor in spirit. Because Jesus tells his disciples, the poor in spirit are the ones that the kingdom of heaven belongs to. And if Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven belonged to those who were poor in spirit or utterly humble and dependent on God, then we need to make a practice daily of that in our lives. So then practicing humility and dependence on God starts with an evaluation of ourselves spiritually. Asking ourselves questions like, do I really rely on God? Do I go to him in prayer for the big and the small things, thinking that he's actually going to see me through on it? Do I see myself as nothing without him? That without the sacrifice of Jesus, I don't stand a chance in a courtroom with God? Do I believe that I'm somehow better than anyone else, even if it is in small ways? These are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves in order to evaluate our own humility. And once we recognize that everything we have, everything that we are, and everything that we're going to be from this moment is built upon that, only then can we have an acceptable mindset towards God. Because Scripture is clear, God doesn't save the proud, he opposes them, as James says in chapter 4, verse 6. Instead, God looks favorably upon those who are humble, contrite in spirit, and tremble at his words. Isaiah 66:2. So our response then to God should be something like this. Again, Scripture never tells us to have childlike faith, but it does tell us to have a childlike dependence on God. One that goes to him often in prayer, confessing our wrongs, like a child would with their parent. Telling God, like we see in the Lord's Prayer, Lord, I need you for my daily sustenance, not for tomorrow, not for a month from now, not for a year from now. Lord, I need you every day to provide what I need, just like you would with your father or your mother. And giving God thanks for what he's done and who he is, showing him appreciation for going out of his way to show grace to a wretch like me. And being poor in spirit is having the attitude that God will exalt you even above the angels of heaven. He's going to bestow a crown of life and righteousness to you, making you a co-heir with Christ, but taking all of those truths and not boasting about it, but instead responding the way that Jesus says, even though those things are true. Listen to what Jesus tells us to respond with in Luke chapter 17. In verse 7, it says, "Will any one of you who has a servant plowing or keeping sheep say to him when he's come in from the field, 'Come at once, recline at my table with me'? Will he not rather say to him, 'Prepare supper for me, and dress properly, and serve me when I am eating and drinking, and afterward only then will you eat and drink'? Does he thank the servant because he did what was commanded?" And then Jesus says in verse 10, "So you also, when you have done all that were commanded, say, 'We are unworthy servants. We have only done what is our duty.'" And it's that kind of humility, that kind of heart posture that God is looking for from us. Because even though it is true that I'm going to go to heaven and you're going to go to heaven and we're going to experience all the riches of God's grace, and as odd as it sounds, we're going to be co-heirs with Christ, and we're going to judge angels, and we're going to have treasure beyond our wildest dreams. Jesus tells us to still have the humility to say, "I am a servant and I have only done what you've commanded me to do." And so while this idea of being poor spiritually feels anti what our everyday life looks like, Jesus calls us to flip our expectations upside down, to lead a life that truly responds to Jesus in humility, to see ourselves as poor in spirit towards Christ. So Jesus says to these kinds of people, the blessing of being in the kingdom of heaven belongs to you. And what is beautiful about this blessing is that it isn't just something that we receive in the future, although that is true. It's something that we enjoy now. It's real inner joy, knowing that the privileges of heaven are freely given to us, that we have an ear with the God of the universe that can take all of our petitions and our thoughts and our cares and our anxieties. It's a freedom from the burden of self-reliance, knowing that I'm not going to heaven because of the kind of person I am. I'm going to heaven because of the kind of person that Jesus is. And so all of these things wrap into what it means to be poor in spirit, and the kingdom belongs to such as these. So this morning, if you have not had the opportunity to experience that blessing, I want to invite you to just think about it for a second. Our culture and our world and our country and even on things like social media call us to think about what is rich in this world, to have the lavish lifestyle, to have the nicest clothes, the nicest house, the nicest car, or whatever, you name it. But Jesus, as he's going to do with the rest of the sermon, is calling us to flip our idea and understanding of what it means to be poor and rich on its head. And while I don't think any of you are choosing to be poor, nobody wants to be poor physically, Jesus is calling you to see the relation to how it means to be poor spiritually and to have a dependence on him. Because if we don't have a dependence on Jesus at the end of the day, none of us are going to make it to heaven with him. But the beauty is that if we do have a dependence on him, if we do come to Jesus Christ humbly, even today, as some of you maybe need to do to start that journey, Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven belongs to you. Would you please come as we stand and sing?